Hi everybody. So today I'm doing a going over a short section on section 2 in your textbook on the nervous system and the endocrine system. We won't cover this in class. This will be your just kind of review and my kind of words on it. So be sure you listen and check over your notes. I'm going to ask you some questions and pause in between and see if you can answer those using your notes. So all right, so the first question is, the nervous system is divided into two main divisions, and what are they? So if you answered central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, there are two that are part of the whole nervous system, and do these systems work separately? No, they work together. That makes a lot of sense. And they do have specialized tasks that they do work on, but they work obviously together like everything else in your body. What's the most important transmitter of messages in the central nervous system? So what transmits messages specifically in the central nervous system? These would be neurons. The neuron is the most important in that. So then my next question is, what's the communicator of messages in the peripheral nervous system? So that is going to be nerves, okay? Nerves are not neurons. They have axons and so forth, but or a bundle of axons, and they work a little bit differently, but they are communicators as well as neurons. That's one thing they do have in common. How are nerves different from neurons, though? Well, nerves are, first of all, bundles of axons, although, and we know that neurons have a lot other parts like a cell body and dendrites and neurotransmitters in them. What gives a nerve its pinkish color on the outside? Good question. The Schwann cells. So the Schwann cells that make up the myelin on the outside of the bundles of axons is actually what gives a nerve its pinkish color. So you can see Schwann cells are, or glial cell, parts of glial cells are part of nerves as well. Okay, what makes up the central nervous system? Sorry, that's so tiny too. That is your brain and your spinal cord. Okay, and they're going to be working together with your peripheral. What's its function? Brain and spinal cord. All your behaviors and mental processes. Also, the spinal cord is going to handle all those incoming and outgoing messages. So we were talking about if you put your hand up to something hot, that ascending neurons and descending, and how those messages are coming from sensory receptors and then going up to the brain, and then the brain is going, and descending neurons are telling what the body to do. The spinal cord is also going to control any automatic spinal reflexes that we have. So sometimes it's something dangerous and your body needs to immediately respond, like, you know, your hand touches a saw that's moving. You're going to have a reflex that is not going to take the time for that message to go to your brain and come right back down. It's going to go to your spinal cord, which is going to immediately pull your hand away, especially when it's hot. And we don't even think about this. This is an autonomic response. It's an automatic. It's not a voluntary response, and it's an involuntary, and it happens very, very quickly for our own protection. So how is the central nervous system protected? Well, we have bone, first of all, skull, and the spinal cord itself is going to protect the nerve bundles that are in there. And then there's 3 layers of tissue called meninges that are also going to cushion the spinal cord. The brain and the spinal cord are also suspended in cerebral spinal fluid, and then the spaces in the brain, then it has ripples and so forth, the ventricles also have fluid in them also that's going to help in case there's impact. And that's sort of what happens in a concussion. Your head will hit this way and your brain actually is floating around in there and will hit against your skull because the impact is so great. This cerebral spinal fluid is there, but it's such a great impact that it hits the skull and it sort of bruises the brain, and then that's when we have some difficulty with concussions. So right here you can see a picture of the skull at the top, and then it actually looks like that. It's not pulled apart or anything. And the brain, you can see at the bottom there, and there's fluid in between there, and you can see it's got some space there and some cushion, even with some of that matter that's between the brain and the skull. And then if we look at the spinal cord, you can see the manganese there. It's pointed out. It's kind of this like protective like layer that's around the spinal cord and all the nerve endings there. Okay, what is cerebral spinal fluid? Where is it in the brain? You can really see it there when you look at the picture to the right, like sort of the water-looking substance there. It fills the hollow cavities called the ventricles. What specialized cells that generate neurons in the brain are in the inner surfaces of the ventricles? What specialized cells that generate neurons in the brain are in the inner surfaces of the ventricles? Those are your neural stem cells. Super important for generating new neurons, and we know that the brain will do that. What's the most important part of the central nervous system? The brain, and it's the command center, okay? Without the brain, nothing is running in the body whatsoever. And what's the job of the spinal cord? Well, to receive incoming and outgoing messages. So more review there. Okay, what sends messages along sensory nerves to the spinal cord and then up to the brain? What sends messages along sensory nerves to the spinal cord and then up to the brain? Those are sensory receptors. All right, so we reviewed a lot of central nervous system. Okay, what or how are muscles activated? Getting into some more function. How are muscles activated? Well, the brain sends a signal down to the spinal cord along motor nerves to the muscles. That's that descending and that outgoing message. What is a withdrawal reflex? That's known as a spinal reflex. That's when the spinal cord doesn't need the brain to function again, and rapid communication is done by sensory neurons that use interneurons, one of our types of neurons, in the spinal cord to relay information to the motor neurons to signal the muscle to contract and move. So a simply involuntary behavior is what a withdrawal reflex is. It is, again, crucial to survival. And we test that in offices all the time. So when you get they take that little tool and they hit your knee and your knee flings out, that's what they're testing for. So they'll do that actually if somebody has a concussion, they'll do it on your elbow and they'll do it on your knee, and they're seeing if you've got some neurological issues, and if it's slower or if it doesn't go at all, then we know that there's an issue with neurons and so forth. So that's what they're testing when they do those tests. And again, they do that in a concussion test. They will do that just to see if there's some kind of message that's being messed up. Okay, and again, this is before the brain can perceive any pain. So one of the things that we'll learn about with pain in the next chapter is, if you think about it, whenever you cut yourself or you burn yourself, isn't there a moment like where it doesn't hurt and then all of a sudden it hurts? And so your spinal cord gets you to pull your hand away from that hot pot or that source of fire or pain that you're getting, and then it takes about a second for now your brain to perceive that pain, and then you can actually feel it. And that's why, because you've got a delay there. Sensory neurons are going to send that message up to the spinal cord, and the thalamus sends information, because that's part of our brain that you'll learn in section 3, that's going to perceive pain, and then you perceive the pain. The somatosensory cortex, which is kind of like up here in this section, you've got your cerebral, okay, your prefrontal cortex, you get a motor cortex, and you've got a somatosensory cortex. That's the section that's going to perceive, ouch, there's pain, okay? So you can see that here, how that reflex actually works. You know, prick yourself on a cactus, and we've got what's called a reflex arc and so forth, okay? And you can see that here even better, where you're getting hit on the knee by that tool in the doctor's office, okay? And it does that reflective arc where it's going to go to the spinal cord and then you're going to contract that muscle. And the same thing is going to happen as you see at the top. You can see the words a little bit better on that bottom diagram where you prick yourself and then that arc's going to happen and it's going to have you contract that muscle and move that muscle away from harm. Okay, what's the difference between the central nervous system and peripheral? Well, the peripheral is all the nerves outside of the central nervous system throughout the body, including the skin. Okay, what are the two divisions of the peripheral nervous system? Two divisions, two separate things. Well, that's the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, okay? What's the job of the somatic nervous system? Well, that works with the central nervous system and communicates sensory information through the body, and it receives it through sensory receptors in like the skin, like you've got all kinds of sensory nerve receptors in your skin everywhere, okay? And then that's going to carry a message along neurons that's going to go up to and you're going to use motor neurons and nerves to communicate. Goes up to the brain, and then we have a voluntary muscle movement due to motor neurons communicating and then motor nerves performing the voluntary muscle movements. Okay, and if you look at the differences there and you kind of separate them out, you can see the brain, the spinal cord, and the central nervous system, and then all of the nerves that you can see. They're very tangible bundles of axons that you can actually see with the naked eye. Okay, what's the job of the two divisions of the autonomic system? And if you look at auto, like automatic, right? It's autonomic, but it's automatic. Okay, it's things that are automatic or autonomic. So we've got, it's going to regulate your involuntary functions, your heartbeat, your blood pressure, your breathing, and digestion, things that we don't think about. And then how do you influence this system how can you influence this system even if it's an involuntary function? So if you think about it, can you bring up your blood pressure? Can you raise your heart rate? Can you raise your breathing? Can't really do much with digestion, but let's go back to heart rate. Can you affect your heart rate? Well, of course you can. You can flex muscles and that's going to raise your heart rate. You can think about a stressful or calming situation and that will raise or lower your heart rate, even your blood pressure at that point. And so we can actually influence some of those systems and our emotions. And we do that. We can even do it through something like meditation. If you've got really high blood pressure and you've got stress going on, you can actually lower some of your autonomic system and those automatic systems and processes by doing things like meditation. So it is, even though it's autonomic, there are some things that we can control. What are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, even further down? That's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems, and those are your fight or flights. And it makes the same organs behave in the same ways. The parasympathetic and the sympathetic affect the same organs, and they do it in different ways depending if you're going into a stressful situation or you're coming out of a stressful situation. So what happens to your body when you're scared? Okay, let's think about the last time that you maybe even thought that someone was in your house, and think about like how you felt, like what was going on with your body. What did you notice when you thought that you were really in danger? Okay, and when we think about that, we think about all kinds of body systems. So, for instance, in your sympathetic, okay, your sympathetic is that survival state. Okay, so sympathetic is your fight or flight. And so, you know, you're ready to go. So your body is going to respond to that. So for instance, your pupils are going to dilate, okay? That's the first thing we think about the eyes. Your eyes get wide. You see people do that in like movies when they're in a scared state. Your eyes get wide and your pupils actually get wider so you can see better and see if there's danger. And that's an evolutionary type thing and a biological thing that we have as human beings and organisms, okay? Your saliva flow will actually reduce and you'll increase your breathing, and your heart rate automatically goes up because of that, but you will increase your breathing in order to be able to respond physically to something. You're going to reduce any kind of bladder contraction, which means you're going to not have to go to the restroom. Your stomach is going to reduce, any hunger. So that's why when people are in stressful situations, they don't get hungry, they don't eat for a few days, because they're in that stressful sympathetic state over a long period of time. Your adrenaline's going to go up, and we talk about that a little bit later. And so you feel like kind of that rush of that. The parasympathetic is going to take over, and it's going to reverse all of that. And that's where you feel sort of that adrenaline, like shakiness. If you've ever been in like a car accident or something like that, you sort of feel shaky after that, and that's your parasympathetic taking over. And then your body's kind of responding to all that adrenaline that you had going on. Okay, what system creates goosebumps? That would be your sympathetic, okay? It activates tiny muscles in the skin to contract, and usually that happens when we're sort of like in a stressful state, but obviously it can happen in response to cold and so forth. And that cold is sort of a survival, you could even say an evolutionary psychologist might say a survival thing where, something's up, like it's too cold for your body temperature and you need to protect yourself. So it's sort of like an evolutionary, signal to yourself to get warm. What's the job of the sympathetic nervous system? Well, that's to produce a physical arousal in response to a perceived threat, okay? May not always be a real one, but it's one that your body perceives. And that's sort of the idea of, anxiety and stress for certain people. It may not be a real one, but they think it is. And so that sympathetic nervous system will take over, and it really can wreak some havoc on people's health. And you get a upright heart, like I said, a heart rate that's going to go up. Your bronchial tubes are going to expand for oxygen, pupils dilate, and you start to sweat because the body is using more energy at that point. And then what's the job of the parasympathetic? I just said it brings you back to normal and maintains your normal body functions and conserves energy and resources. Okay, endocrine system. This is a whole other system that's involved as well. Okay, so the endocrine system, what is that made up of? Well, it's made up of glands, which you can see there on the right. And that's the main thing. And then how does the endocrine system communicate information in the body? It secretes hormones into the bloodstream, okay? Until they reach hormone receptors on specific organs or tissue, it's definitely slower than nerves and neurons that go a lot faster. And once it gets to those receptors on those organs, then it starts to create a reaction in the body. It may stimulate also like a neuron or be inhibited by the nervous system, and hormones can do the same as nerve impulses. Just like any of the other systems, it can stimulate or inhibit things from happening. What's the effects of hormones? It regulates your physical processes and influences your behavior as a result. So metabolism, it can affect growth, digestion, blood pressure, sexual development, and emotional responses as well. Okay, what's the main link between the endocrine system and the nervous system? What helps them work together? And there's a clue on the page. The hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus, as you see there, it's in the midbrain or in the limbic system, and it controls the pituitary gland that you see there, super important, our master gland, which secretes the hormones. What's the master gland? The pituitary, and it regulates the production of hormones in the other glands. So a really important gland. It also produces growth hormone to grow a child's skeleton. It also is involved in endorphins to reduce pain, prolactin for nursing mothers to produce milk, which I'll go over in a second. What's the hormone that produces the letdown reflex during the breastfeeding, contractions during birth, and sensitivity to social cues and bonding between partners and parent and infants? That's oxytocin. It's the love hormone. So again, it promotes a bond in relationships between romantic partners or parents and infants. But also oxytocin, the way that works with breastfeeding is the nerve impulses from sensory receptors in the mother's skin. So the mother will feel like a baby and so forth, and the baby is touching the mother. That will send a message to the brain, and then the hypothalamus signals the release of the oxytocin from the pituitary. So the pituitary and the hypothalamus work really well together. And once that oxytocin is secreted by the pituitary gland, then the milk will flow for the baby so it can breastfeed. What are the negative effects of oxytocin? Just like we talked about with neurotransmitters having too much, too little, an influx of that, any kind of chemical imbalance in oxytocin, you could do that. And again, it can create some anxiety, aggression, and antisocial behavior. It can also, when you're bonded with groups, even though it's the, bonding kind of hormone, it can create distrust or social anxiety instead of trust. Okay, and then lastly, what's the pair of glands involved in response to stress? And you see them there. There's weird, like kind of kidney-shaped glands. They're called the adrenal glands. And there's the adrenal cortex and the adrena medulla. And you can see what it looks like there on the page. The outer is the adrenal cortex that you see there, and the medulla is like the inside of that, and it's covered at the very top of the whole gland itself. And what does the adrenal medulla secrete to help with fight or flight? And so that's how the endocrine system and the nervous system are working together along with the central nervous system. So it is epinephrine and norepinephrine. So what we talked about before with these neurotransmitters. Okay, so epinephrine, adrenaline, and norepinephrine help the sympathetic nervous system function effectively. So you get adrenaline and so forth to help you do that fight or flight. What are the gonads for females and males? Ovaries, and they're going to secrete estrogen and progesterone. And then testes is going to secrete androgens. And then both are going to have testosterone. We've talked about that even women can have aggressive behavior if they have higher levels of testosterone. And these particular hormones are going to obviously are your sex hormones, so they will influence sexual development and behavior, reproduction, and then brain structures and functions also in relation to those things as well. One thing to note is on page 58 in your book, it has a great chart here, and I would study that chart, okay? And it has all of what the endocrine system is about. So the pineal gland produces melatonin, which helps with your sleep cycles. The hypothalamus, it says it controls the pituitary. The pituitary is your, it produces growth hormones, prolactin, and oxytocin. Your thyroid gland is for metabolism. The adrenal gland, it talks about the norepinephrine, epinephrine. Pancreas regulates your blood sugar and insulin and is involved in hunger. And then it talks about the ovaries and the testes as well, which we just went over. So that's a really good chart to kind of take some notes from too. All right, if you have any questions, let me know.